Hello, this is Janet from janetsandberg.com, and you're listening to the Phoenix Wisdom Podcast, the weekly show that talks to peers and professionals who open up about their darkest moments when they felt like ending it all, why they didn't, and how they transformed their lives in order to triumph over the darkness and despair. Please remember to subscribe if you'd like to hear more inspiring stories. Hello, and welcome to the Phoenix Wisdom Podcast. Our guest today is Janette, and I am going to get her to introduce herself right off the bat.
Thanks so much, Janet. So my name is Janette O'Neill Burns. I am a transformational guide, birth and breath coach, and I've been in this spiritual awakening world and coaching world for the last few years. And my husband and I kind of went through it together. And yeah, what a journey it's been.
All right. I'm so glad we're together today for this conversation, and I am looking forward to hearing not only your story, but your unique spiritual perspective on things as well. Um, so, why don't you tell me where you were, what was happening when things were bad, when you thought about taking your
Mm,
own life? What was going on there?
mm. If I'm actually thinking about it, it actually started when I was a teen.
Hmm.
And I think most of our teens are going through this. I know I have teenagers that are as well. And so it definitely started as a teen. I want to say I was around 12, 13, 16, 17 were different stages where it started. And I grew up without a dad. And that abandonment and father wound was, as I know now, very deep.
Hmm.
And um, where it really came deep in my experience when I was 26 years old, and I, from the outside, had the perfect life. I
Hmm.
had gotten back together with my ex, who I had my first daughter, my first child with. I was a single mom with her for the first 2 years, and him and I got back together, and it was the fairy tale. I grew up without a dad, so I didn't want my daughter to grow up without her father.
Hmm.
And going through that pregnancy alone, and then the first 2 years was difficult. And so when we got back together and decided that we were going to get married and have a family, and he said all of the right things, we decided to have another. And that in that moment I was so excited. I couldn't wait to share that with my partner. I couldn't wait for all of the things. And so from the outside, it was really beautiful. Um, and then the abuse started or continued, I guess. It kind of paused and then just ramped up. And so I was pregnant. I was deep in my pregnancy with my son, and I found out that I was having a boy, which is exactly what I wanted. He was everything I ever wanted. And secretly, I contemplated how I would end it all. And the only thing that kept me was the two things was there would be no way that I would be able to do it and not harm the beautiful human that I was growing,
Right.
or I knew that I couldn't leave my daughter
Hmm.
without a mom. And, those thoughts, those ideations that we think about where and how we would do it, I couldn't do it because I would not want her to find me. And so those are the
Wow.
things that kept
Yeah.
me, right?
Yeah.
So it was deep. And as a birth doula, that completely transformed what I do for a living, and understanding that deep womb and the trauma that we hold in that area as an energy healer. It's deep. And we all have a story, whether it's through suicide, whether it's through depression, anxiety. There's something about the womb of a woman and what she creates in that space, but then what trauma gets stored there as well when you
Hmm.
go through abuses and
Yeah.
experiences that you can't necessarily get out of because from the outside world, it seems perfect.
Hmm. Well, and I'm just thinking of those juxtapositions in your life. Like, on the outside, everything seems perfect, happily married, all of that, but it's an abusive relationship. You don't want to live anymore, but you're growing life inside you. Like, I can't even begin, like, the relationship part. I understand. I was in
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
but just having, like, that's a big enough um contrast in and of itself, but
It is.
not wanting to be here but growing a life at the same time. Like, there just must have been so many conflicting thoughts and feelings, and
Hmm.
just going in circles, I would imagine, just all the
Constant,
time.
constant. And so when you do go for help or it's forced down your throat, you know, which is quite literally what happened with me is, well, we need to help you, Janette. So you need to get on medication. And meanwhile, while my intuition at the time was like, you don't need medication. There's nothing, you don't have a chemical imbalance right now. And so the confusion of that was, well, then what do I have? If I don't have a chemical imbalance, what is it? And I had been so torn from what my intuitive guidance system was at that time
Hmm.
that it was such a distant, dark voice, so far away that I could just barely hear it. And the moments that I would, speak up for myself, there were times of, me taking the pills and just flushing them down the toilet. And then, the physical abuse would ensue. Um, you know, the emotional, abuse of, me, being accused of literally harming our child and an unborn child. It was a nightmare. It really was. And then the extended abuse that I don't even talk about, is, the behind closed doors stuff, the really behind closed doors stuff while I was pregnant is, no wonder people, feel this way. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, it's no surprise, but at the same time, I realized that it was something that um, clearly there's an evolution of cycle of self and soul that we come here to experience.
Mm.
And
Yes.
our humanness is never going to understand. I still don't understand it, but yet there's that deeper intuitive part of me that does understand, which thankfully I listen to now and I find comfort in it. But it's a really difficult one for the human to experience, especially because, here we are 14 years later, and I have a distant relationship with my son. And I can see the cycle and the like the cyclical events unfold and why it's like I could almost tell you that of course that was going to happen. And in the manifestation world, it's like, well, did you manifest that? It's like, no, this is something deeper. you know yeah, it's yeah, it's been a
Yeah.
journey.
It it definitely has been. And we're all grateful that you're still here, and especially doing the healing work that you do now. But going back, I'm just thinking, like, the craziness of that human story where, you're in a physically abusive relationship, but everybody is telling you that it's your mental health that's suffering,
Yeah.
and you're being gaslit left, right, and center. People saying,
Yeah.
no, no, you have depression, you have all of these things, and you're like, no, I'm in a situation. that
Mm-hmm.
is clearly happening to me, but
Yes.
nobody else can see it,
Yeah.
despite, I was in an emotionally abusive relationship, which is a lot harder to pinpoint that it's happening.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of gaslighting that goes on there too. But when you're
Oh, yeah.
in a physically abusive relationship, but nobody knows, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then they're like, oh, but it's fine, you're fine, everything's fine,
Mm-hmm.
you just need a little help.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with medication. I am medicated and it's the best thing that ever happened to me,
Right.
but not because,
It was
other
forced on
it
you.
was forced on me because people couldn't see what was really happening.
Right.
And we feel so alone, like we were talking before we started recording,
Yeah,
that
we scream for help,
we
but
scream for help. We're so afraid that nobody will understand what we're going through. We feel like we're the only person that
yeah.
that 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 could ever feel this way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and sometimes, just getting people to understand what we're going through can be an issue, and yet at the same time, there's so many of us that understand. So
Mm.
it's about telling your story to the right person.
Mm. And it's interesting because for me, I don't feel like that story ever, like the story never got out. And, if I'm being honest, y- mine actually mostly was emotional. There was just partially physical sexual abuse that was happening. And that was the other thing too, is that while being pregnant and then bringing baby into the world, um, this is another reason why I'm so passionate about birth and empowering women to have their own birth story and know that they have a choice in all of these things. Because that was another thing. Not only was the medication, but even the whole thing surrounding my birth with how and where and being called crazy, so much crazy
Mhm.
for wanting the like the natural way, or I was doing a hypnotherapy birth, like hypnobirth. And so it was like, oh, you're crazy for that. And, just take the epidural, just take it, and it's like, even that was just like the icing on the cake. And so what happens is that you just don't have enough fight in you. Like you
Mhm.
just don't have anything left. You just I couldn't tell you how many times I just laid there and just like surrendered in not the good way, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
Um yeah, and so that birth story too, I look now into um even just epigenetics and what the human inside of you experiences, like what you experience when you're pregnant is completely cellularly like programmed into the DNA. Like the the fetus doesn't even have a fighting chance. Like my
Right.
son, if I'm to even, if I'm really to be real, he didn't even like, yes, I've come to this understanding now from a soul perspective that he chose this. He chose me. He knew that I was going to go through this. We had a soul contract. That is what helps me like be okay every day. But it still doesn't make the physical human journey easy because I'm constantly, you know, wondering what I could have done differently.
Mhm.
How could I have protected him more? How can I make him safe now? How can I make him feel loved now? And he doesn't get that from me. He only gets it from me energetically.
Right.
And so consciously, he has no idea because he doesn't feel loved, you know? He feels abandoned. He feels so many things. And isn't it? He feels all of the things that I felt
Right.
as a child. And so, hence, we see this cyclical pattern that is created over and over again with families. My
Yeah.
daughter, same
Yeah.
thing. It was like she experienced abuse We experienced abuse from the same abuser, and that is her DNA. That is,
Mhm.
she's had to do all kinds of, years of therapy and will continue to heal that father wound. And I experienced a father wound. I'm 40 years old just healing my father wound now, right? Um, I think she's healing hers younger, which is great, because
Yes.
he's getting the help that he needs,
Mhm.
but it doesn't
Well,
erase what happened.
it doesn't, but that's why we're having these conversations, is
Yeah.
so that we can we can reach people at a younger age. Like, we have
Mhm.
so much more reach now than, when I was in high school, nobody even talked about
Right.
depression or anything. And now it's so much more open. We still have a long way to go, which is why I'm doing this podcast. But we are sharing stories. We are talking about it so that people will have, even if they still don't have that safe place to um, let it out, they at least know that they're not alone just by listening to us.
Yeah.
Um, but I wanted to just go back. So you said, you had suicidal ideations, but you couldn't figure out a way to do it, and you wanted to stay for your kids. So how? So you obviously chose to stay, even if it was a just because I can't figure it out, even if it
Mhm.
wasn't necessarily like a choice to stay, if you
Mhm.
know what I mean. You
Mhm.
still ended up choosing to be here. And then how did you go about changing your situation? Because you have a new husband now.
Yeah.
So obviously things
Things
changed and you were
changed.
able to get away from
Yeah.
that situation.
Yeah. So it took time. I know that I went through postpartum depression. So I experienced depression while I was pregnant, but then postpartum obviously was was definitely there. I experienced it in a different way than some moms do. I didn't feel uh, I didn't feel a disconnect with my son. Like, if anything, I was like just so in love with him. Um, but I was still feeling those feelings of not wanting to be here. So that was, I didn't, so my postpartum depression, and I think postpartum depression, it can't just be labeled, one certain way, but I
Oh,
know in some ways,
definitely.
right? Women, they feel that, just that separation with their baby. I didn't feel that, but I was in that state of, how can I be so in love and so happy right now, but then want to not be here? So that was heavy for like the first year. And then when I did so many things. I started CrossFit. I was, getting into, just women's groups and things like that. But I was also in Ontario at the time, and I felt very isolated from my family. And that was difficult. Although we were surrounded by his family and they were definitely welcoming, there is a herd mentality of that family that is also very um, power hungry, narcissistic, and um, gaslighting, just all of those things.
Mhm.
And so I lost myself quite a bit in that relationship. Like I said, my intuition was like very, very, I didn't listen to that intuitive guidance system at all. So as we were trying to get through, because we were supposed to get married, and that kept on getting postponed, which obviously happened for a reason. And finally, his military contract was done. And I just said, we need to leave because I'm not happy. And so we were able to be posted back to New Brunswick. And that was my only way out. And
Mhm.
so we came back, not to my hometown, but where we had met and gone to university. So at least it was only an hour away from my family. And at least I
Right.
was in New Brunswick. So that was good. Now, that being said, I hated that city. I didn't want to be there. And when I finally got to the point, because there was, adultery stuff that had happened. And so when I had, and again, the abuse and everything that still continued, especially, yeah. So as that continued, the biggest thing that I knew that I wanted was for my daughter not to see me be treated that way. And to know that there was men different than that. And I didn't want her
Yes.
to think that that was normal. And even just raising them, I just remember moments of, they could spill milk on the table, and it was like they feared for their life because they spilled
Wow.
milk on the table. And he didn't see that as not normal. Like, he didn't think that there was anything wrong with that. And, my kids still suffer from this, like, getting in trouble thing. Like,
Mhm.
it messed with their mental capacity to understand, like, fight or flight reflexes
Mhm.
and responses that are normal and not normal, you know?
Right. Well, when everything is dire,
Right.
you can't differentiate
Yeah. And it would
between
be
a
little
minor
things.
thing and a major thing.
Right. And so I remember having my friends. I probably would have been now back living home for about 6 months. And I remember my friends coming up, and it's 6 months to when we're supposed to get married, and they literally had an intervention. It was like, Jeanette, you can't marry this guy. I know that he's the father of your two children, but you cannot marry this guy. And I was like, but who would want me? Right? Like, we go
Mm.
through that. And so, and then the thing that really, again, I want people to understand that there are patterns that are happening in their life. They're repeating, like, parental patterns as well. So I'll give you an example. I grew up without a dad, and the one thing I wanted and desired the most of all is to have a full blood sibling. And subconsciously, maybe even a bit consciously, another reason I got back together with my ex is so my daughter had a full sibling, blood sibling,
Oh,
right?
okay.
Like, I can honestly admit that. So then the other thing is that I didn't want to be like my mom. I didn't want to be a single mom. I didn't want to not be married and, have my daughter be raised the same way I did. And so we end up choosing the opposite, thinking that that's going to be the answer, but it's not the answer, right? The
Yeah.
grass is not always greener on the other side. And so after that intervention, a number of things had happened, and then finally that there was a straw that broke the camel's back. And when we had ended things and parted our separate ways, it still was 8 months of him going back and forth of us almost getting back together again. And it took him, you know, uh, literally, when again that cycle, still continued, that back and forth, that back and forth. I finally had to, I saw my daughter, 5 years old, and she didn't want to, she didn't want to be around him. She didn't, and little things like, she's, my daughter's gifted, and she, you know, spoke to spirit. And for him, we weren't allowed to believe that angels existed because we were idiots if we did, you know?
Sure.
So, how can you foster a spiritual relationship? And so that was another, again, I didn't realize it until, later. But again, it just came back to, my daughter and my son, they have to see a different way. I know there's a better way. There's somebody else on the other side. And so we ended, finally cut those ties completely, even months after we had split. And so often in those abusive relationships, you do go back and forth, right?
Mhm.
You
Yeah.
don't you don't just cut it immediately. There's something there. And so that obviously continued. Um, and then meeting my husband, uh, we have a great story because we actually knew each other and we didn't even know that what had happened is we were going through betrayal from our ex-partners at the same time, and that is what brought us together. And it was the fluke of a message that, like, hey, I'm going through a divorce. Ah, yeah, I heard. I'm really sorry for you. So am I. That was it. And then next thing you knew, there was more deeper connection with him and I in the first conversation we ever had than he had in his 9 years of his marriage and me with my ex. And I was like, oh, wow, okay, there's something here. So I did have a happy story. I'm with someone. We have two of our own children. My daughter considers him to be her father, like, sure, she has her dad and she's healing her own father wound, but you know, um, he took in my children like they were their own, like his own. And it's unfortunate that, that divide that is with our son right now is there, but I know that it's happening for a reason.
Mhm.
I don't know what that reason is, but soul has a plan. It
Yeah.
always did.
And it's not necessarily permanent either.
Right.
You know,
Nothing is.
that no. And
Mm.
especially with teenagers, they have to have the time to sort things out for themselves and
Absolutely.
come around to the right conclusion eventually.
Yeah.
But they do need that. But I want to go back to this intervention.
Yeah.
Like, just kudos to your friends for speaking up, for
Mm.
seeing what they saw and saying something about it.
Yeah.
Because so often we see the signs, but nobody wants to ruffle any feathers.
That's
Nobody
so
wants to
true.
take any risks. Nobody wants to be like, are you really okay? And
Hmm.
not take the, yeah, I'm fine for an answer.
Yeah.
The fact that they stood up for you
Yeah.
is amazing
Yeah.
in so many ways.
It took me a couple weeks, even with that intervention, again, there was something that played out in the way that, he wasn't being faithful and there was all kinds of things, that were occurring. It was a deep betrayal because that betrayal was with my best friend.
Oh,
my
no.
my confidant that lived in the same city. We worked together. She was my assistant manager. I was managing a store at the time, and she was like, she was it. And it turns out, that wasn't obviously my high school. It was my high school friends that did the intervention who knew me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, and so it did take a couple weeks even after that intervention, but they always planted those seeds of, like, Janette, you know. And here was the thing, that what goes on in our head. First of all, I had a wedding. We had called off our wedding once or twice, I think, prior to this. So my parents were just dying to see me to get married. And I say parents as in, like, my dad and my stepmom and then my mom, like, especially my dad and my stepmom. And so it was like, I can't let them down. How many of us go through these relationships that we're so unhappy with because we don't want to let other people down?
Well, just life in general, getting
Right.
the jobs or moving
Yeah.
places, living places, making just general
Yeah.
life choices because we don't want to let other people down.
Yeah. And we would literally drive ourselves into the darkest place
Yeah.
just to do that. And so that was a really difficult thing for me to do, to call that wedding off. I literally called it off a month before we were supposed to get married. And that was so difficult. Um, but yeah, my friends, thankfully. And now the other thing with that, depression also, and having these, like, dark moments, I've also had these moments periodically, even with my husband, to be honest. But never to the extent. And it was always my ex that could trigger that for me. So it,
Yes.
I'm literally living the most perfect life, but co-parenting with a narcissist, which isn't talked about, you know, and how to facilitate a healthy relationship with a narcissist or facilitate even a healthy relationship with your children that you have. It's so difficult. And that completely polluted our a whole decade of our life together.
Yeah.
And that was, and in those moments I had moments of not wanting to, be here anymore. Never as dark as when I was pregnant with my son, but they definitely, I remember a few. Now, does that mean that I needed medication or whatever? It was never that for me. Um, so who knows what it is? I don't know what
Yeah.
the label is. I don't know what the answer is. I don't know what the remedy is. I don't know what the solution is. I just know that we can be completely healthy and still have these feelings.
Yeah. And we've talked about this with other guests that, once you've been there, it's easy to go back.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah.
That's kind of our baseline.
Right.
So every once in a while when things are going bad or we just have those moments, it's easy for us to go back there. And often, at least for myself, it's more of a check-in where
Hmm.
it's like, I'm having whatever is going on. Maybe I should just not be here. And then you're like, no,
Right.
I'm not really there, but that's just where
Yeah.
our brain goes.
Right.
It goes right back to the very bottom
Yeah.
to realize kind of how far we've come.
Yeah. And it also doesn't, it almost, it's a really great way that you put it for a baseline because I've done so much personal development, so much mindset work, so much energy work, so much of, again, a spiritual awakening. And it keeps on evolving. And so there's this other part of me that also battles with the mindset and that's always it's a battle, I guess, in my mind of, well, I know how to get myself out of it, I guess is what I'm trying to say. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's the knowing and doing gap, I always say, right? Like I know better,
Yes.
but for some reason that baseline catches you sometimes,
Yeah.
especially when you have those triggers and those people that bring you right back.
Yes.
There's a lot of healing work to do there.
There is. There is,
Yeah.
but it can be done.
It can be. Yeah.
It can be done.
Yeah.
Amazing. I would just like to ask you one more thing, which
Yeah.
is just a parting thought, a slice of wisdom for our listeners. Um, Now that, you've been there and you've triumphed, and now things are so much better than they were.
Hmm.
Um, what can you share from your journey to the people who are just at the beginning of it?
Mm. There is always a light. There always is a light. And to keep faith that that light is always shining, that you can always get out of the darkest hole, that it's literally just a blip in time. There is no time and space. This is just a moment that your soul chose this deep rooted contrast to experience, and it's going to bring you as much darkness as you are experiencing in that moment. If you can imagine the other end of that extremity of joy and wonder and exploration and experience, and that it's just rich in that abundance of what life has to offer, that's what you'll get. That will come if you choose, but you always have a choice. Or at least, I mean, that's for another story too, right? Our souls, you know, our souls are wise. And if you get to feel that choice and that you can come out with that choice, know that there is something on the other side. There always is, and it is so much better than you could have ever imagined. And it does get better, and that you're not alone. There's so many people. There's so many people that can help you. There's so many people that have been here, and it's just a blip in time. It really, really is. You're here for a reason. You are so flipping important. You are like one in a trillion billion zillion that even incarnated here. And so your ripple effect, right? We didn't even touch on the ripple effect, right? Of what we experience when we experienced a loved one that has taken their life. The ripple effect, it will always continue no matter what choice you make.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes. Beautiful.
Mm.
Thank you so much. And I'm just gonna hold on to that light for myself for a little while. But thank you for being here and for sharing your story and
Thank you.
for, yeah, all of your wisdom and your work in the world. And yeah, thank you for being here.
Oh, I'm so grateful that you have me. It's it's one of those things that I think my final parting would be to have these spaces that even when you hold these in, know that it's time to let them out. And when you feel that moment that it's time to, like I shared with you, I don't talk about this often, right? Um, it's been inside for a decade. Don't leave it inside.
Mhm.
It's meant to come out.
It
Yeah.
is. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janet.
Thank you for listening. Remember that you are loved, you are worthy, you are valuable, you are meant for more, and that it really does get better. If you are in crisis, there are numbers that you can call or text to get the help that you need. That information for Canada and the US is in the description below each episode. If you are in immediate crisis, please call 911. We love you, and I hope you'll listen again.